The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as Sergeant Major James Harrison adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he believed would be another routine day of royal duties. At 42 years old, James had dedicated nearly 2 decades of his life to the Royal Guard, serving with unwavering loyalty through 3 different monarchs. His polished boots reflected the early light as he made his way across the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of royal history. James had grown up in a small village outside Manchester, where his grandfather used to tell him stories about serving King George during the war. Those tales had sparked a dream in young James that eventually led him to enlist in the British Army at 18. His exceptional service record and unwavering dedication had earned him a coveted position in the Royal Guard 5 years later, a role he had cherished ever since. The castle was buzzing with unusual activity that morning. Word had spread through the staff quarters that Queen Camilla would be hosting an important ceremony later that day, though the details remained unclear to most of the guards. James had noticed the increased security preparations and the arrival of several high-ranking officials, but such events were common in royal life, and he thought little of it. As he took his position at the main entrance, James reflected on the changes he had witnessed over the years. He had served during Queen Elizabeth's final years, witnessing her grace and dignity even as age began to slow her steps. The transition to King Charles had brought its own adjustments, and now, with Queen Camilla taking on more prominent ceremonial roles, the dynamics within the castle continued to evolve. James remembered the first time he had met Queen Camilla, shortly after her marriage to then Prince Charles. She had been kind but formal, acknowledging his service with a brief nod. Over the years, their interactions had remained professionally distant, which was exactly as protocol demanded. The Royal Guard was trained to maintain absolute respect and deference to all members of the royal family, regardless of personal opinions or feelings. The morning progressed normally until around 10 o'clock, when James noticed an unusual commotion near the private quarters. Several staff members were hurrying about with worried expressions, and he caught fragments of hushed conversations that mentioned something about unprecedented requests and breaking with tradition. His training had taught him not to pay attention to palace gossip, but something about the atmosphere felt different that day. At precisely 11:30, James received word that he was to report immediately to the Blue Drawing Room, where Queen Camilla was preparing for her ceremony. This was unusual, as guards typically maintained their positions unless specifically summoned for security reasons. As he made his way through the ornate corridors, passing portraits of long-dead monarchs who seemed to watch him with stern expressions, James felt a growing sense of unease. The Blue Drawing Room was one of the castle's most magnificent spaces, with its silk-covered walls and priceless artwork creating an atmosphere of overwhelming grandeur. Queen Camilla stood near the tall windows, dressed in an elaborate gown that sparkled with jewels. Several advisors and officials surrounded her, their faces bearing expressions of concern and uncertainty. When James entered the room and came to attention, Queen Camilla turned toward him with an expression he had never seen before. There was something in her eyes that seemed both determined and desperate, as if she was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. The other people in the room stepped back slightly, creating a clear space between the Queen and the guard. "Sergeant Major Harrison," Queen Camilla began, her voice carrying an unusual tremor. "I have called you here today because you represent the finest traditions of the Royal Guard. Your service record is exemplary, and your loyalty has never been questioned." She paused, seeming to gather herself before continuing. "What I am about to ask of you today will test that loyalty in ways that protocol has never anticipated." James remained at attention, his mind racing to understand what could possibly require such an elaborate introduction. Throughout his years of service, he had faced many unusual situations, from security threats to diplomatic incidents, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the tone of gravity in the Queen's voice. Queen Camilla moved closer, her elaborate dress rustling against the polished floor. "There are those within these walls, and beyond them, who question my authority and my right to wear this crown," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Today, I intend to put those questions to rest once and for all. I need to know that I can count on the absolute loyalty of those who serve the crown, not just in word, but in deed." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the distant sound of tourists in the courtyard below. James could feel the eyes of everyone present focused on him, waiting for his response to whatever was coming next. His military training had prepared him for many scenarios, but this felt like uncharted territory. "Your Majesty," James replied in his steady professional tone, "the Royal Guard serves the crown with complete loyalty and dedication. We are bound by oath and honor to protect and serve the royal family without question." It was a response he had given many times before, but something about this moment made the familiar words feel inadequate. Queen Camilla nodded slowly, but her expression suggested that his standard response was not what she was looking for. She exchanged glances with her advisors, who seemed equally uncertain about how to proceed. The tension in the room was becoming almost unbearable, and James found himself wondering what he had been brought here to witness or participate in. "Sergeant Major," the Queen continued, "loyalty is not just about following orders during normal times. True loyalty is tested when we are asked to do things that may seem unusual or even uncomfortable. It is about demonstrating absolute faith in the authority of the crown, even when that authority is being challenged by others." James felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand that this was not going to be a routine ceremonial duty. Something significant was about to happen, something that would require him to make choices that could define the rest of his career and possibly his life. The weight of his 20 years of service seemed to press down on him as he waited to learn what Queen Camilla was about to ask of him. The Queen moved to stand directly in front of him, close enough that he could see the determination in her eyes, mixed with something that looked almost like desperation. "Today, in front of these witnesses, I need you to demonstrate your loyalty in a way that will leave no doubt about where your allegiance lies. I need you to kneel before me, not as a ceremonial gesture, but as a personal acknowledgement of my authority over you and everything you represent." The request hit James like a physical blow. In all his years of service, he had never been asked to kneel to any member of the royal family outside of his formal oath-taking ceremony. Such a gesture would be deeply personal rather than professional, crossing boundaries that had been carefully maintained throughout his career. More importantly, it felt wrong in a way that he couldn't immediately articulate, but that resonated deep in his bones. James struggled to maintain his composure as he processed what he had just heard. The Queen was asking him to perform an act that went beyond normal protocol, something that felt more like submission than service. He thought of his grandfather's stories about serving with dignity and honor, about the pride that came from wearing the uniform of the Royal Guard. This request seemed to contradict everything he had been taught about the relationship between the crown and those who served it. The silence stretched out as everyone in the room waited for his response. James could feel sweat beginning to form under his ceremonial jacket, despite the cool morning air coming through the windows. This was a moment that would define him, and he knew that whatever choice he made would have consequences that extended far beyond this ornate room. As he looked into Queen Camilla's eyes, James saw something that troubled him deeply. This was not a confident monarch making a reasonable request of a loyal servant. This was someone who seemed to be grasping for validation, for proof of power that apparently needed to be demonstrated rather than simply acknowledged. The realization that the Queen might be acting out of insecurity rather than strength made his decision suddenly much clearer. "Your Majesty," James said carefully, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "I have served the crown faithfully for 20 years, and I will continue to do so until my last breath. However, I must respectfully request clarification about the nature of this ceremony and why such a gesture would be necessary." Queen Camilla's expression hardened at his response. She had clearly expected immediate compliance, and his request for clarification was obviously not part of her plan. The advisors around her began to whisper among themselves, their concern evident in their hushed tones and worried glances. "Clarification?" the Queen repeated, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "I am your Queen, Sergeant Major Harrison. When I give you a command, your duty is to obey, not to question. The very fact that you would ask for clarification demonstrates exactly the kind of attitude that necessitates this demonstration." James felt the weight of the moment, pressing down on him like a physical force. Everything he had worked for, everything he believed in, was being tested in this single conversation. He thought about his fellow guards, about the traditions they upheld, about the meaning behind the uniform he wore with such pride. Most of all, he thought about what his grandfather would say if he could see this moment. The Queen stepped even closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Kneel, Sergeant Major. Show me the loyalty you claim to possess. Prove that your service is more than just words and ceremony." Her eyes held a challenge that went beyond royal authority, something personal and desperate that made James realize this moment was about much more than his individual compliance. James Harrison stood motionless in the blue drawing room, feeling as though time itself had frozen around him. The Queen's command hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall, and every person in the room seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented moment would unfold. In the silence, James could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, drowning out even the distant sounds of the castle's daily operations. His mind raced through 20 years of training, searching for guidance that had never been provided because no one had ever imagined such a situation could arise. The Royal Guard manual was extensive, covering everything from security protocols to ceremonial procedures, but nowhere in its pages was there instruction for what to do when personal integrity collided with royal commands in such a direct and troubling way. James thought about the oath he had taken when he first joined the Royal Guard, the solemn promise to serve with honor and dignity. But what did honor mean in this moment? Was it blind obedience to authority, regardless of the nature of the command? Or was it something deeper and more principled? His grandfather's voice seemed to echo in his memory, speaking about the difference between serving and being servile, about maintaining dignity even in the face of power. "Your Majesty," James said finally, his voice remarkably steady given the turmoil inside him, "with the greatest respect, I cannot comply with your request." The words seemed to hang in the air like a thunderclap, and he could practically feel the shock waves rippling through the room. Queen Camilla's face went through a rapid succession of emotions, surprise, anger, and then something that looked almost like panic. She had clearly expected compliance, and James's refusal had obviously not been part of her calculations. The advisors around her began to murmur among themselves, their voices creating a nervous buzz of concern and confusion. "I beg your pardon?" the Queen said, her voice rising slightly. "Did you just refuse a direct command from your sovereign?" The incredulity in her voice was genuine, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just heard. James maintained his position at attention, his military bearing serving him well in this moment of crisis. "Your Majesty, my service to the crown has always been guided by the principles of honor, duty, and dignity. The gesture you are requesting goes beyond the bounds of appropriate military protocol and crosses into territory that I believe diminishes both the office you hold and the service I represent." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the full impact of James's words settled over everyone present. One of the advisors, a thin man with nervous eyes, stepped forward as if to intervene, but the Queen held up her hand to stop him. Her gaze remained fixed on James with an intensity that would have been intimidating if he hadn't already committed himself to this course of action. "Sergeant Major Harrison," Queen Camilla said, her voice now controlled but carrying an unmistakable threat. "You seem to have forgotten your place. I am not making a request. I am giving you a direct order. Kneel before your queen, or face the consequences of your disobedience." James felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced since his early days in the military, the clear, clean certainty that comes from knowing you are absolutely right, even when the cost might be everything you've worked for. It was the same feeling his grandfather had described when talking about the moments in war when a soldier had to choose between following orders and following conscience. "Your Majesty," James replied, "I have never forgotten my place. My place is as a guardian of the traditions and values that the crown represents. If I were to kneel to you in this manner for these reasons, I would be betraying everything that my uniform stands for. I would be failing in my true duty, which is to preserve the dignity of the institution I serve." The Queen's composure began to crack visibly. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of anger that was spreading across her face, and her hands were trembling slightly as she processed the unprecedented nature of this confrontation. None of her advisors seemed to know how to handle the situation, and their uncertainty only added to the tension filling the ornate room. "You dare speak to me of dignity?" Queen Camilla's voice rose to nearly a shout. "You are nothing but a servant, a man in a uniform whose only purpose is to do as he is told. Your opinions about tradition and dignity are irrelevant. Your only job is to obey." The harshness of her words seemed to surprise even the Queen herself, and she took a step back as if realizing she had revealed more of her true feelings than she had intended. The advisors exchanged worried glances, clearly recognizing that this confrontation had moved far beyond anything they had anticipated or prepared for. James remained calm, though he could feel his own emotions threatening to break through his professional composure. "Your Majesty, I have never been just a servant. I am a soldier, sworn to protect not just the person of the monarch, but the principles and traditions that give meaning to the monarchy itself. If I compromise those principles, even at your command, I would be failing in my deeper duty to the crown." One of the advisors, an elderly woman with silver hair, finally found the courage to speak. "Perhaps we should consider postponing this ceremony until we can discuss the situation more thoroughly," she suggested tentatively, clearly hoping to diffuse the escalating conflict. Queen Camilla whirled on her advisor with fury. "There will be no postponement. This man will show me the respect I am owed, or he will face the full consequences of his insubordination." Her voice echoed off the silk-covered walls, and for a moment, the royal facade completely disappeared, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. James realized that this confrontation had revealed something important about Queen Camilla's state of mind. This wasn't really about him or his compliance. This was about her own insecurities, her need to prove her authority in the face of what she perceived as challenges to her legitimacy. The request for him to kneel wasn't about honoring the crown. It was about feeding her personal need for validation and control. "Your Majesty," James said gently, his tone becoming more compassionate despite the circumstances, "true authority doesn't need to be proven through forced gestures of submission. The crown's power comes from the respect it earns through dignified leadership, not from the fear it can instill through demands for humiliation." The Queen's eyes widened at his words, and for a moment something vulnerable flickered across her face before being quickly replaced by renewed anger. "How dare you presume to lecture me about authority?" You are finished, Sergeant Major Harrison. Your career, your pension, your reputation, all of it ends today because of your arrogance and disrespect." James felt a pang of sadness, not for himself, but for what this moment represented. 20 years of faithful service were indeed likely coming to an end, but not because of any failure on his part. They were ending because he had chosen principle over convenience, integrity over career advancement. It was a choice his grandfather would have understood and respected. "I accept whatever consequences may come from my decision, Your Majesty," James replied with quiet dignity. "But I will not accept the responsibility for creating this situation. I was asked to do something that violated my oath to serve with honor, and I chose honor." The room fell into another tense silence as everyone absorbed the finality of James's words. The Queen's advisors looked increasingly uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that this confrontation had spiraled far beyond what anyone had intended or could easily resolve. The ceremony that was supposed to demonstrate royal authority had instead created a situation that could potentially damage the monarchy's reputation if word of it spread beyond these walls. Queen Camilla seemed to realize this as well, as her expression shifted from fury to something more calculating. She was clearly beginning to understand that her attempt to force submission had backfired spectacularly, creating exactly the kind of public relations nightmare that the royal family worked so hard to avoid. "Leave this room immediately," she commanded, her voice now cold and controlled. "Report to your commanding officer and inform him that you are being relieved of all duties pending a full investigation into your conduct. You are banned from all royal properties effective immediately." James came to attention one final time, executing a perfect salute with the same precision he had maintained throughout his career. "Yes, Your Majesty," he said simply. Then, with the same measured pace he had used when entering the room, he turned and walked toward the door, his polished boots clicking against the ancient floors with a sound that seemed to echo through the centuries of royal history. As he reached the doorway, James paused for just a moment and looked back at the scene he was leaving behind. Queen Camilla stood in the center of the magnificent room, surrounded by advisors who clearly didn't know how to fix what had just been broken. Her elaborate dress and jewels couldn't hide the fact that her attempt to demonstrate power had instead revealed her weakness. "Your Majesty," James said quietly, his voice carrying across the room with perfect clarity, "I hope someday you will understand that true loyalty cannot be commanded. It can only be earned." With those words, he stepped through the doorway and began the long walk out of the castle he had called home for 20 years. Behind him, the blue drawing room erupted in urgent whispers and worried conversations as Queen Camilla's advisors tried to figure out how to contain the damage from what had just occurred. But James didn't look back again. His decision was made, and whatever came next, he would face it with the same integrity that had guided him through this impossible moment. The corridors of Windsor Castle felt different to James Harrison as he made his way toward the exit for what might be the last time. Each step echoed with a finality that seemed to resonate through the ancient stones, and the portraits of long-dead monarchs that lined the walls seemed to watch him with expressions that were impossible to read. Some appeared stern and disapproving, while others seemed almost sympathetic, as if they understood the weight of the choice he had just made. Word of the confrontation in the blue drawing room spread through the castle with remarkable speed. By the time James reached the main corridor, he could see groups of staff members huddled in quiet conversation, their voices dropping to whispers when they noticed him approaching. The mixture of curiosity and concern in their eyes told him that rumors were already beginning to circulate about what had happened between him and Queen Camilla. As James approached the security checkpoint where he would need to surrender his access credentials, he encountered several of his fellow guards. Their faces showed a complex blend of shock, admiration, and worry. These were men who had served alongside him for years, who had shared the pride and responsibility that came with protecting the royal family. Now they were watching one of their own walk away from everything they had all worked so hard to achieve. "James!" called out Corporal Davies, a younger guard who had always looked up to him as a mentor. "What happened in there? Is it true that you—" He trailed off, unable to finish the question that everyone wanted to ask, but none dared to voice. James paused, considering how much he should or could say about the morning's events. His military training emphasized discretion and loyalty, even in difficult circumstances, but he also felt a responsibility to help his colleagues understand that some principles were worth more than career security. "I was asked to do something that I couldn't reconcile with my oath as a royal guard," James said carefully. "Sometimes serving the crown means protecting its dignity, even when that protection isn't appreciated by those who temporarily wear the crown." His words were measured and diplomatic, but their meaning was clear enough to those who knew how to listen between the lines. The guards exchanged meaningful glances, understanding more than James had actually said. They had all heard stories about unusual requests and inappropriate behavior from various members of the royal family over the years, though nothing quite like what seemed to have occurred that morning. The fact that James Harrison, known throughout the Guard for his unshakable loyalty and professionalism, had chosen to walk away spoke volumes about the nature of whatever had transpired. As James continued toward the exit, he was approached by Lieutenant Colonel Matthews, his immediate commanding officer. Matthews was a career military man who had always respected James's service record, and the expression on his face suggested that he was struggling with the situation as much as everyone else. "Harrison," Matthews said quietly, pulling him aside, "I've been ordered to conduct a formal investigation into this morning's events. You understand that I have to follow protocol, regardless of my personal feelings about the matter." His tone was apologetic, but firm, reflecting the difficult position he found himself in. "I understand completely, sir," James replied. "I'm prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation. I have nothing to hide about my actions or my motivations." The confidence in his voice seemed to provide some reassurance to his commanding officer, though it was clear that Matthews was still troubled by the unprecedented nature of the situation. "James," Matthews said, his voice dropping even lower, "off the record, can you tell me if what I'm hearing is accurate? Did Queen Camilla really ask you to kneel to her in some kind of personal submission ceremony?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both men understood perfectly. James looked his commanding officer in the eye, recognizing the difficult position the man was in. "Sir, with respect, I think my actions speak for themselves. I've served this institution faithfully for 20 years, and I wouldn't throw away my career lightly. Whatever happened in that room, I acted according to my conscience and my understanding of what the Royal Guard represents." Matthews nodded slowly, his expression showing that he understood exactly what James was telling him without forcing him to violate any confidentiality obligations. "Very well, Harrison. I'll make sure the investigation is conducted fairly and thoroughly. In the meantime, you're suspended with full pay pending the outcome of the inquiry." The formal suspension was no surprise, but hearing the words still stung. James had never imagined that his career would end this way, with uncertainty and controversy rather than the dignified retirement he had always envisioned. But as he thought about the alternative, kneeling in submission to validate Queen Camilla's insecurities, he felt certain that he had made the right choice. As word of the incident began to spread beyond the castle walls, the response was immediate and dramatic. Within hours, news outlets across Britain were reporting on the confrontation between Queen Camilla and the Royal Guard, though the initial reports were contradictory and incomplete. Some portrayed James as a hero standing up for principle, while others suggested he was an insubordinate soldier who had forgotten his place. The story captured public attention in a way that surprised everyone involved. Social media platforms exploded with discussions about loyalty, authority, and the proper relationship between the monarchy and those who served it. Many people expressed admiration for James's courage in standing up to what they saw as an inappropriate abuse of royal authority. Others argued that his refusal to obey orders, regardless of their nature, represented a dangerous undermining of the constitutional monarchy. James found himself at the center of a national conversation he had never wanted to join. News crews gathered outside his modest flat in London, hoping for interviews or statements that he consistently declined to provide. His phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, book agents, and political activists who wanted to use his story for their own purposes. The pressure intensified when several members of Parliament began calling for a formal inquiry into Queen Camilla's conduct. Opposition politicians seized on the story as evidence of royal arrogance and abuse of power, while government supporters tried to minimize the significance of the incident. The royal family found itself embroiled in exactly the kind of public relations disaster they had worked so hard to avoid. 3 days after the confrontation, James was contacted by Lord Pemberton, a respected member of the House of Lords who had served in various royal ceremonial roles for decades. Pemberton requested a private meeting to discuss the situation, claiming that he was acting on behalf of concerned parties within the establishment who were worried about the damage being done to the monarchy's reputation. They met in a quiet pub far from the media attention, where Pemberton explained that influential figures within the royal household were deeply troubled by what had occurred. "Your actions have exposed something that many of us have been concerned about for some time," Pemberton said carefully. "There have been other incidents, other inappropriate requests and demands that have been handled quietly to avoid exactly this kind of public scrutiny." James listened with growing concern as Pemberton described a pattern of behavior that suggested the morning's confrontation was not an isolated incident. Other staff members had apparently been subjected to similar demands for personal submission and degrading treatment, though none had possessed the courage or position to resist, as James had done. "The palace is prepared to offer you a substantial settlement," Pemberton continued, "along with a full restoration of your position and benefits, in exchange for your agreement to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement about this entire matter." The offer was clearly designed to make the problem disappear quietly, but it also revealed how seriously the royal establishment was taking the potential consequences of the scandal. James considered the offer carefully. The money would be life-changing, and the restoration of his career would solve all of his immediate practical problems. But accepting the settlement would also mean abandoning the principles that had led him to refuse Queen Camilla's original command. It would mean becoming complicit in covering up behavior that he believed was fundamentally wrong. "Lord Pemberton," James said after a long pause, "I appreciate the offer, and I understand the difficult position everyone is in. But I can't accept a settlement that requires me to stay silent about what happened. If there are other people being subjected to this kind of treatment, they deserve to know they're not alone, and that someone is willing to stand up for what's right." Pemberton's expression showed disappointment but not surprise. He had clearly expected this response, though he had hoped that the financial incentives might overcome James's principles. "I understand your position, Harrison, but I hope you realize the forces you're choosing to fight. The monarchy has survived for centuries by managing crises quietly and efficiently. They won't hesitate to destroy you if they feel it's necessary to protect the institution." The warning was clear, but it only strengthened James's resolve. He had already lost his career and faced financial uncertainty. The threats of further retaliation seemed almost anticlimactic compared to the choice he had already made in the blue drawing room. Over the following weeks, the story continued to dominate public attention. Several former royal staff members came forward with their own stories of inappropriate treatment and demands for personal submission. The revelations painted a picture of a royal household where power was often abused, and basic human dignity was sacrificed to satisfy personal insecurities and inflated egos. James found himself reluctantly thrust into the role of a spokesperson for these forgotten victims of royal abuse. He testified before a parliamentary committee, gave carefully worded interviews to respected journalists, and worked with legal advocates to ensure that other staff members had protection and support when they came forward with their own experiences. The investigation into Queen Camilla's conduct eventually led to significant reforms in how royal households operated. New protocols were established to protect staff members from inappropriate demands, and independent oversight mechanisms were created to ensure that complaints could be made and investigated without fear of retaliation. 6 months after that morning in the blue drawing room, James received an unexpected letter. It was written on official government stationery and signed by the Prime Minister himself. The letter informed him that he was being awarded the Order of Merit for his exceptional service to the principles of dignity and integrity that underpin British democratic institutions. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by close family and a few government officials. As James received the medal, he thought about his grandfather and the stories of serving with honor that had inspired his own career. The old man would have been proud to see his grandson recognized for choosing principle over convenience, even when the cost was everything he had worked to achieve. In his brief acceptance speech, James spoke about the importance of institutional integrity and the responsibility that comes with wearing any uniform in service to the public. True loyalty, he said, echoing the words he had spoken to Queen Camilla months earlier, cannot be commanded through fear or demanded through submission. It can only be earned through actions that honor the values and principles that give meaning to the institutions we serve. As the ceremony concluded and James shook hands with the various officials in attendance, he felt a sense of completion that had been missing since that morning at Windsor Castle. He had lost his original career, but he had gained something more valuable, the knowledge that when tested by circumstances beyond anything he could have imagined, he had chosen correctly. The medal now sits on James's mantelpiece next to a photograph of his grandfather in uniform and a letter from a young royal guard who wrote to thank him for showing that it was possible to serve with integrity even when facing impossible choices. Sometimes, James reflects, the most important service we can provide is the willingness to say no when yes would compromise everything we stand for.